Bruce Dillman. Dean has done a pretty good job of introducing me over the last few weeks. He's not here today. He's on vacation, and Peg insisted on going with him, so she's not here to help with the microphone or anything. But so he asked me to take this DVD. We've been doing, if you've been here, how many have been here for the last 2 weeks? Because if you've been here, you know we've been sort of doing a walkthrough finding ancient artifacts. We started a couple of weeks ago by looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Last week we took a look at looking for Noah's Ark. Today we continue with Mount Sinai. Now, Dean handed me the DVD and goes, "This is all you need to do. Just plug this DVD in and play it." So I took it home and I plugged it in. I said, "You know, this DVD is only 45 minutes long. So I could let you out in 45 minutes, but I'm not gonna lose a chance like that." So I'm going to show you the DVD. We're going to look at their theory about where Mount Sinai could be. And then I'm going to share with you a little bit of research that I did that's a little different than the DVD. And then we're going to talk at the end about pretty much the last 3 weeks. You know, what all this means to look for these things and just kind of what does it mean for our faith life. So that's kind of where I want to go today, just to kind of give you sort of an overview. I'm going to be working with Pastor Dean next year to transition to taking over Hope University. You'll learn a lot more about me then. Okay, some of you may know that I already do have a background in religion. I was a Roman Catholic priest. I'm currently working to be a Synod parish deacon. All my paperwork is in and just have to wait for the Synod to act on it as I continue to discern God's call in my life, and especially my call here at Hope, which I am so unbelievably blessed to be part of. The day I walk through that door, I thank God. I literally thank God every morning that He led me through the doors of this church. I hope you all feel the same way. So let's start by looking at the DVD, and then we'll talk a little bit on the other side of it.
You said the Senate. What's that?
The Synod is the geographic organization that we are part of. So for us, it's Florida and Bahamas. We have one big geographic organization which all the Lutheran churches, all of ELCA churches fall under.
So they're checking background stuff?
Well, right now I've turned everything in, and the committee has to look at what I've turned in and said, "Yep, you did everything you're supposed to. You're good to go." But I've done it all, and so, you know, Pastor Mark is great because he knows I've done it all, and so we're moving on. And the Senate will eventually join us.
He's been through it.
Yes, he has been through it, yes. And he understands well that, you know, you get your paperwork in, they say, "Well, that committee just met last week, they'll meet in another 6 months." Yeah. And that's kind of where we are now. This committee doesn't meet until July. So, you know, you just have to kind of... So, anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the DVD, and then, like I said, we'll talk on the other side. Now, I hope my computer works okay with this. I came in on Saturday and worked with... I mean, there's some really interesting things, and there's some things in here that I'm going to come to at the end. But what I want to spend a couple minutes doing here is, if this will let me, first of all, they talked about the traditional Mount Sinai. How many of you have traveled like to the Holy Land and places like that? And I mean, if you've done it, then you know that you know what they talk about the circus there. If you've done any kind of traveling, then you see, especially when you go to traditional sites where things are located, whether you're talking about Old Testament events like this, or if you're in Israel and you're seeing something that Jesus, so this is a place where he was, where he did this or he did that. Things have built up over the centuries, and you have literally a circus going on there, right? If you travel, you know that that's the case. All right. Well. what I want to do here is just spend a couple of minutes actually looking at an alternative. This is actually a more recent study that was done by a different group who thinks that Mount Sinai is actually somewhere else. And then at the end, I want to kind of talk about, well, how do we reconcile all this together? So what we have right here is we have, oh, it's not going to show up on there. Oh, you can't see it, so I'll just point to it. Here is your traditional Mount Sinai right here. Okay? This is where they're saying Mount Sinai is. And how many of you thought the whole idea of the way they crossed the Red Sea was pretty interesting? Yeah, I think that's one of the most fascinating points they make in there. What I'm about to show you is a theory that thinks that Mount Sinai is actually up here. Okay? So I just want to kind of show you the geography there. We're talking about the Israelites. We know they're enslaved in Egypt over here, right? And we know eventually they're going to get to the land of milk and honey, which is going to be up here. Okay? And when they leave Egypt after their slavery, they're going to go to Mount Sinai. Now, you're going to be hearing about that. How many of you are going to be here this summer? If you're here this summer, we're going to be talking about the Ten Commandments. I'm preaching on Sunday, June 3rd, so I've been doing a lot of research on the Israelites coming out of Egypt and going to Mount Sinai, where God speaks directly to them. The first time God speaks to them, the tablets come later on. So Mount Sinai is a real critical piece of this, and you know where it is also. So let's take a look at this particular theory. The name of the mountain that they're going to talk about is called Mount Yeroham. Now, first of all, look at the closeness to Jerusalem here as far as, you know, okay, you go to the Sinai mountain, you give the Ten Commandments, and the people are getting ready to go into the land of milk and honey. Okay, which is Israel up there. So look at the proximity of how close it is to that. Okay? This is not a traditional choice, as the people who did this study point out. This is the name. It's Gerald E. Ardasma, a PhD. In 1995 is when he actually came up with what he thought these were findings. And he says, does this sound familiar from what we just saw? He has a convincing body of evidence. Didn't they just say that a minute ago? A convincing body of evidence. I mean, think about it. If you watch any lawyer shows or you watch any kind of trial kind of shows on TV, both sides say, we have the convincing body of evidence and we're going to convince you that my client is guilty. No, I have a convincing body of evidence. I'm going to convince you that my client is innocent or not guilty. So that's kind of comes with the territory when you're looking at these kinds of things. So I want to talk about the criteria that they looked at in their particular study to come to their conclusion. And kind of think about what we just saw with this group who was saying that it was the mountain that's down in the Sinai, or down in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so criteria number one, distance from Egypt. Well, first of all, it has to be outside of Egypt. But it can't be too far outside. Okay, because they came out of Egypt and this happened rather quickly. So the further away you get from Egypt in the time frame that we're looking at, the less likely a candidate for Mount Sinai would not be. The scriptures kind of indicates it's about a 45-day trip after leaving Egypt. Okay, now for us, a 45-day trip in a car could get us pretty far. But for them, I mean, consider we have 2 million people wandering. How would you like to be the one leading 2 million people? I mean, it just boggles my mind to think of what Moses' job would have been like. I mean, if you ever feel overworked, just think of Moses leading 2 million people. So he assumed about 30 miles a day, but he allowed non-travel days. There were days when they were in battle. There were days when maybe they rested. You know, days when they grumbled. They did that a fair amount of that as well. And so he comes up with his hypothesis is Mount Sinai can be no more than 630 miles from Egypt. Well, the mountain he's looking at is 150 miles from Egypt. That would have given him lots of days of rest. So it passes the first test. Okay? But so does the one we looked at in the video. It also passes this test. Okay, criteria number two that they look at, not in Midian. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because You can find Scripture passages that indicate that it is and it's not. Does that ever happen in Scripture where you can find contradictory things? Okay, well, if this is your criteria, you believe that it cannot be in Midian, and he basically uses the Scripture, this is where Moses is from, okay, then that's going to color what you're looking at. So he says it's in the northern Negev, which means it passes this criteria. Okay, next. Room for the Israelites. 2 million people take up a lot of room. Okay, it talks about a desert wilderness in front of Mount Sinai. Now, I wish the video would have talked a little bit more about this, but did the video imply that there was plenty of room for them to be able to set up their tents? Okay, there were several candidates, and when you research where Mount Sinai could have been, that you can't have them because it's all mountains around it. There's no place for the people to be able to stay. So it says there were 600,000 men were present in the camp. We know it wasn't just men. So by the time you take the women and children into consideration, if you allow a 10 by 10 foot square for each man and his family, it would require at least 1,377 acres, according to him. And the area in front of Mount Yerahim measures at least 3,000 acres. Again, the video that we saw, and I couldn't find anything that indicated how much there was there, but if you looked at the video, it looked pretty vast. Okay, I was trying to picture 2 million people living there. Of course, I can't picture 2 million people living in tents anyway, but so he says it passes that test. Okay, here's a picture, by the way, of what that area looks like in front of it. Okay, next, the presence of pottery shards. Now, did they talk about the fact that there were relics that were left there? They showed the arrowheads, and they talked about that. But they never really talked about the day-to-day utensils of living. 2 million people who live someplace for a year, they're going to leave behind some trash. Okay? And theoretically, when you do some archaeology on that, you're going to find that trash. Yeah, man.
So we know that they were there for a year?
Scripture indicates it was about a year that they were there. Okay? So give or take. It was a while that they were there. So this was not an overnight kind of thing. This particular mountain has all kinds of pottery shards in that field that's below it. There's a picture of what those shards look like. All right? And I'll talk about the carbon dating here in a couple of minutes, but there are the presence of pottery shards. Okay? Finally, there's there's actually 2 more tests. Adequate water supply. 2 million people require a lot of water. All right? Now, did the video talk about that? And how many thought that was pretty interesting about the rock and the... Yes. Those are the 2 things I picked up on were the crossing of the Red Sea and the rock. Those were 2 things that I thought were extremely interesting about that. Okay, well, we know that 2 million people are going to have water. Well, there's a large reservoir that's at the foot of Mount Yerahim today. And it's bigger than it would have been then because a dam has been built that's helped it. However, the reason there's water is because there's a natural spring there. And that natural spring would have provided water. There's a picture of what it looks like today. You can see the presence of water on it. And so, according to him, it passed. Okay, finally, the correct time period. And this is the acid test. So if you can test things, any kind of artifacts you find, they have to be of the same period, at least narrow it down. Okay, and there have been lots of theories that have been advanced about places, and it doesn't pass this test because anything you find is not from that. Okay, so modern biblical chronology has shown that the Exodus was the cause of the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, terminating what's called the Early Bronze III, Early Bronze III in Palestine. So what's really happening here is you're going from one to another. Early Bronze III is becoming Early Bronze IV. Okay? So that is the official name of what it is that you're looking at here. This was if you find something that dates to the time of Early Bronze IV, those people are the Israelites that we're talking about here. When they carbon dated this, they found that it matched this criterion. Now, did they talk about that in the video? They didn't really talk about it specifically, but they did talk about the style of what they found matched the style of the way it would have been done in Egypt. And okay, they've been living in Egypt for so long that it's very reasonable to think that that's the way they would make things because that's where they have been. So this is implied, I think, in the one that we saw. All right, so just a couple further things. That altar, that was pretty fascinating too, wasn't it? Okay, well again, that comes from Scripture, okay, that Moses arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And they showed that with the possible chutes for animals to be able to come down. They showed the circular stones that could have been part of these pillars. Well, at this place as well, there is a high place which suits the biblical account very well. All that remains today is a rock wall surrounding the crest of the spur and some cut marks in the bedrock surface with outcrops within the ring of stones. The high wall is visible in this photo that I'm about to show you. And it's in the back there. Now, that doesn't look as much like an altar as what we saw, right? But there's still a high place that could have been, and according to him, could be an altar. And then one last little thing here. And the Bible records that Moses' Midianite relatives, which are also known as the Kenites, an ethnic group that was distinct from them, were with him. So they were also at Mount Sinai. Well, again, I didn't know anything about these people, but when I read what he was talking about it, the word Kenite means metal worker. And actually there's scriptural evidence that there was metal involved. And it says, about them, your dwelling place is enduring and your nest is set in the cliff. Well, archaeologists have found the remains of structures that look like nests set in the cliff. They contain pottery from the correct time period. And as this one archaeologist here reports, there were a hoard of 18 copper ingots with low lead content, which suggests the existence of some kind of a metal industry, which is what the Midianites would have done. So again, he looks at that as being evidence. And there's a picture of one of the nests. Okay? Again, if you've traveled, there's ruins everywhere, right? I mean, you can, no matter where you go, oh, there's ruins, I wonder what that is. You know, so sometimes if you have not traveled, you look at something like this and you say, well, that has to be it. Look at all the ruins, they're there. Well, you go 2 miles down the road, find another mountain, and there's some ruins there too. You go another 2 miles, find another mountain, and there's more ruins there. So just the presence of ruins, unfortunately, is not enough. All right, so this is where I want to end it. I want to kind of look at the last 3 weeks. We looked at where is Mount Sinai. My intention today was not to say, you know, this theory that I just gave you here, this is the right one, the video's wrong. I just wanted to show you an alternative. Okay, just to kind of give you a flavor about what it's like when you are looking for the authentic. You know, you can look at a theory and watch a movie and you say, wow, that's it. That sounds so convincing. But then you go over here and you can hear another theory and you listen to it and go, wow, that's so convincing. Wait a minute, I can't have both of these. It has to be one or the other. Okay, but that's part of the nature of the game. So when it comes to where is Mount Sinai, well, we have the traditional and we have at least 2 others I've shown here. Guess what? There's more, but we don't have the time to go into all those. What about the Ark of the Covenant? 2 weeks ago, did we see the same thing there? Did we see more than one theory? Now again, do you have the place where all the people go? Yes, you have the place where all the people go. Is that the right place? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You know, tradition sort of dictates some of those things. And archaeology and these groups go and try to take a look at it. So where is it? Well, again, like with Mount Sinai. This theory says here, this theory says here, this theory says here. Could it be in all those places? No. But it could be one of those or it could be somewhere else. And then what about Noah's Ark? You know, same thing. We looked at that last week. Where could that be? Now, we're not talking about a small thing here. Of course, Mount Sinai is not a small thing either. Okay? So do we really know definitively? You've been here now. Some of you have been here for all 3 weeks. Do you know definitively where any of these 3 things are? I don't. I don't know where any of those are. So my question is, do we need to find any or all of these for our faith lives? Do we need to know where these are? Is it going to make our faith life better? Or is it kind of interesting?
Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The traditional Mount Sinai, people have believed that for centuries. So their faith can't be dependent on their believing that that was Mount Sinai.
Which brings up the question, if all of a sudden we found that it was actually somewhere else, what about those people who were there at the traditional Mount Sinai? I mean, that could really, again, if you put all your faith in it being right there, can it be dangerous then to think, yes, it's absolutely here, and this is where it is, and it can't be anywhere else, and my faith depends on that? Can't that be a little bit dangerous? So I think that's kind of what I'm getting at with the heart of this question. Do we need to find them for our faith lives? And then the last question I have up here is, what would finding or not finding them mean to you? And I want to kind of expand this question because I love the way they talked about the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay, now how many of you have seen the Cecil B. DeMille version of the Ten Commandments, right? Okay, so whenever you hear the Ten Commandments, is that what vision pops in your mind? It's the vision that pops in my mind. I just love seeing these walls of water, and wow, they go through, and then all of a sudden, boom, in comes the water. How dramatic, how wonderful. Is that what they described in that video?
No.
In fact, if you look at where they're talking about that the Israelites could have crossed, it's a place that has a coral reef, right? Now, why could it have been exposed? Well, they showed it at high tide. What would happen at low tide? It would lower and you would cross over, right? Then what happens when high tide comes back? It gets covered. What if that's what happened? I'm not saying it is, but what if that's what happened? Does that destroy your faith? Does that say, in fact, doesn't that require more faith? I mean, think about these people, these Israelites who get to the other side and go, look at what just happened back there. God is taking care of us. God has brought us to the other side. And if you actually look at the account of Exodus, there's more than one tradition that have written that. And there's one tradition where the wheels of the chariots get stuck in mud. Okay? The Israelites didn't have chariots. They were able to get through. The Egyptians got stuck in the mud. Again, what if that's what happened? I wasn't there. Right? You all were there. So my question is, do these things, finding these things and things happening the way we've always thought, does that dictate or does that make our faith? Any thoughts on that?
It's just telling us that God's going to take care of us. It's telling us that God's going to take care of us.
Which requires
Faith.
faith. Because is that evident every day? Well, through certain eyes it is, right? But are there days when it's really tempting to say, just don't feel like I'm being taken care of today? Okay, so I actually look at some of these things and think, that increases my faith. To believe that God is acting in things that, when I look at that crossing of the Red Sea, or when I look at the rock splitting, they talk about a geyser coming up. Well, doesn't that kind of cheapen Moses just hitting it with the stick and miraculously water's coming up? It's like there's a scientific explanation for this. Could that be possible, that what we're reading about is something that's scientific? And if it is, does that hurt my faith? It actually, for me anyway, it makes my faith stronger. If that's what happens, if I look at something and say, you know what, I know that you, non-believer, you could explain it this way, but I look at that and I see God acting. And I think that's a stronger act of faith than it is to say, well, it's a miracle. Does that mean miracles don't happen? I don't know about you, but I've seen them in my life. But the miracles make it easy to believe, don't they? Miracles make it easy. It's easier, yes. Is it ever totally easy? No, but... So I think the question I want to kind of leave you with at the end of what we're looking at here for the last 3 weeks, it's a lot of fun to look for these places. I mean, I have a math background. I was a math teacher. So I love things to be cut and dried. I like to be able to say with definitive certainty, this is what it is, this is where it is. It's frustrating for me when I can't do that. But when I can't do that, it actually helps my faith. And I hope that helps your faith as well, because that's what it's all about. I'm glad you are close by because it's easy to get the microphone to you.
I was just wondering if there's any recent views of that Saudi Arabia site. I mean, we have satellites up there taking pictures all over the world. So I was wondering if there's anything new since the 90s.
I wasn't able to find anything that was different from this, just people that are piggybacking on this, taking that research. So again, I wasn't really able to find anything. What appears to me is happening as far as Mount Sinai is going is the recent research is piggyback on what's actually out there. So there's no new theories that are up there. But you're right. I mean, now satellite imagery makes it easier to be able to see things, especially, I think Pastor Dean made that point last week, that some of these places are impossible to get into now. They're located in countries where, we're not very welcome and very dangerous to get into, and it was true even back then. Yeah.
Did the third site have any drawings of calves?
There are none that they mention, okay? The drawings, the hieroglyphics, which again, is that kind of compelling? Yeah, it is compelling.
I've just always been wondering, who finances all this research and who pays the bills?
Yeah, the question was who, and it really depends upon the study. Universities typically are going to be the places that are going to do that, but foundations who are looking, okay, private fundraising is done as well, because it is not cheap. In the case of these guys in the video, they did a lot on their own. So some people are so, yes, driven. Thank you. That's exactly the word I was looking for. They're so driven. I need to find this place because I personally want to find it, so I'm going to take my savings and I'm going to spend it. And then you start finding something, and other people come in and go, I like that too. I think what's interesting about the video is actually there were those two gentlemen and that family doing it separate from each other, and then they discover each other and they compare their findings.
If I got this right, the family was allowed to go up the mountain because they worked for an oil company. Yeah, I thought that was interesting that they could go and they could do, and the kids were, not defacing things, but I'm surprised that they weren't checked a little bit closer than that with some of this stuff. But interesting, and the other two guys couldn't go near it.
Yeah, in fact, that was kind of interesting how those other two gentlemen got in, right? So when in doubt, just come up with the facts and put a prince's name on the bottom of it, and that'll get you in.
The security must have been much more relaxed, much more,
Yes, relax.
relaxed when they were in because they were trying to hide and they got caught, the two, and the family was there, they said over 8 years.
Yeah, and probably two gentlemen who are just there as opposed to a family who's already working there, they would have looked at them differently. Again, this is the early 90s, and so I'm sure now much, much different and much harder to get in there.
How confusing do you want it to get?
How confusing do I don't want it to be confusing at all. I want it to, if you have an answer, then, yeah.
Well, not an answer, I got questions.
David has an answer.
No, there's Exodus 17, that you're talking about. And then in Numbers 20 is maybe a separate event. And then 1 Corinthians 4:10, I think, is where Paul says that the rock followed them through the journey, always giving them water.
Okay, so there we go. So now, what about that split rock? Well, if you have enough mules, maybe, but somehow got back there, though, So again, as David points out too, and this is what I found when I was looking at this, and we all know this if we've looked at Scripture. I love the fact that all these things we've looked at for the last 3 weeks have been scriptural based, and they use Scripture. But as you also know, the danger of using that is sometimes you can find a passage that says the exact opposite. So it's good to use it, but it's good to supplement that with other documents and other kind of data as well. So anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed these last 3 weeks as we've it's a very interesting foray, I think, to kind of look into where these places could be. But I hope for you, like for me, my faith is not going to be affected if we never, ever find any of those three. I mean, my faith will be strong as it can be, and I don't need them to have faith. And so I think that's kind of where I wanted to end it. All right, so thank you all. I look forward, I think next fall, Pastor Dean and I are going to split like 4 weeks and 4 weeks. I'm going to do 4, he's going to do 4. We'll kind of do that throughout the year in our transition year. So I really look forward to this. You all are wonderful folks because you have lots of, what is it? I was telling Anita. Well, we all have lots of age, but you have lots of experiences, and you come to this with lots of experience and intelligence, I think. You know, we have people here who we're all wandering, trying to find the way, and we're bringing everything that we've learned and we know into that, and I just think that's wonderful that we do that. Okay? All right, thank you all very much.